Hello, my name is Dale Smith and I'm a pathologist at the Ontario Veterinary College at the University of Guelph in Canada. I'm going to be talking in this session about diseases and pathology of a variety of species that we're classifying as zoo and exotic animals for a combined session of the C.L. Davis Foundation and the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. I'm just going to start off with covering a little bit about the animal groups that I'm going to talk about. So if we could go to the first slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about species that are not covered as clearly in the rest of this presentation, or this series of presentations at the C.L. Davis Foundation. So I'm going to start off talking a little bit about the amphibia, then move on to some reptiles. After that, birds, focusing primarily on psittacine birds, one or two other things that I think might be of interest, a little bit on the ratites since they have some interesting pathology and they're not covered elsewhere, and then some mammals, predominantly ferrets, and then what I've classified broadly as zoo animals. And my context is primarily with animals in zoo or private collections rather than looking at free-ranging wildlife, although there is certainly a fair bit of sort of transfer back and forth or commonality among the animals and their diseases. I'd like to emphasize that when we move away from the domestic animals that people are most common with, there tends to be a little bit of sort of fear of the unknown. And it's really important to recognize that the general patterns of disease that we see in these animals are going to be the same. So animals are animals regardless of where they're found. In the sorts of situations that I'm talking about, and with the kind of species that are less commonly recognized as domestic or have been in domesticity for a shorter period of time, issues around husbandry are much more important than they are with many of our standard domestic animals. So husbandry, nutrition, environment play a big role in the immune system and thus in the development of a variety of diseases. We see all sorts of interesting infectious and parasitic diseases, and because many of these animals are held for a long period of time in collections, we'll also see degenerative and neoplasia or neoplastic problems or geriatric conditions that we would certainly perhaps be used to seeing in domestic animal pets, but less so in production animals and certainly very rarely in wildlife. We also are going to talk about some things that might be considered natural diseases for the species, for example, canine distemper in a carnivore or in a canid, but also diseases that transmit from one species to another because in pet stores, in zoological collections, in all kinds of exotic animal collections, there is a lot of mixing of species that would normally be in contact with each other. And a good example of that would be prairie dogs. It might not be unexpected to see plague in a prairie dog, especially if they've been vacuumed out of the wild before being moved into the pet trade, but certainly no one expected to see monkeypox in conjunction with the mixing of species that happened in the importation of diseases from Africa. We're also going to see some diseases that are transmitted from one place to another, so a disease that, for example, might be quite natural in the original setting for the animal but gets translocated to a new site when the animal is moved. And of course there are always emerging or new diseases, many of which involve wildlife or exotic animal species. So we'll dabble on a few of those. I wanted to just touch a little bit of taxonomy before I start because I think it's important to at least be able to lump animals into the general category where they belong so that you can recognize who their buddies and friends are or their relatives are and therefore who you might be getting the same diseases as. So again, we're going to talk about amphibia, reptilia, aves, and mammalia. And just to touch base so you've got a little bit of an idea on who is who with these, when we talk about the amphibians, we're talking about the caudata or the salamanders and axolotls, and I have one or two slides of those, the gymniofauna, who I'm not going to touch on, and then the anurans or the frogs and the toads, and many of my slides pertain to them. We're also going to look at reptiles. We'll look at the testudines or the chelonia, so the turtles and the tortoises. A few slides on crocodilia, crocodiles, caimans, alligators. The tuatara is the sole member of the Rhynchocephalia, and I'm not going to talk about that, but I will talk about some of the squamates, not the worm lizards, but particularly the lizards, such as we have here, and also the snakes. So we'll cover a fair number of the reptiles. Birds are an extremely large and diverse group of animal species. There are over 9,000 different species of birds, and they have extremely varied natural histories. We have birds that walk but can't fly, birds that swim that can't fly, birds that fly but can't walk. So, and they eat a whole variety of things. So to consider all birds as similar is really a great oversimplification. I'm going to talk about the ratites groups, the ones raised commercially that are members of the Palaeognathai, or the older birds. And then I'm going to touch a little bit on the falconiforms, or the diurnal birds of prey. But most of my focus is going to be on the psittaciformes, or the parrots that we might see as birds in captive collections or as pet birds. And then one or two diseases of the passeriforms, which are also relevant. Again, when we move into the mammals, we have an incredible diversity of species and of diseases. So I'll just touch on what I consider to be a few highlights and pull a few things out of the recent literature as well that perhaps people should be aware of. And if we just look at an overall view of the taxonomy of the Mammalia, you can see that the ones highlighted in red are where I'm going to be mentioning. And even though I may have a fair number of slides, I'm really only brushing the surface of what might be possible. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the diseases of the artiodactyls, some carnivores, Chiroptera or bats, some of the Australian marsupials, the Dasyuromorphia, the carnivorous marsupials, as well as the Diprodontia, which include the koala and the wombats and the kangaroos, which are what people really think about as Australian species. Touch on the insectivores, a couple of perissodactyls, so zebras and tapirs, elephants, a rodent, and then we'll finish off with a couple of anteaters. So that will give you a bit of an idea of where we're going with this. Carnivora, primarily Canidae and Felidae. Herpestidae, or the mongooses, mustelids, I'll be focusing particularly on ferrets, and then vivarids, or the Herpestidae as well. Equidae, which would be the zebras, tapirs, and then the artiodactyls, which are going to be very similar to animals which are seen more domestically, so the hoofed mammals, antelope, bovidae, camels, deer species, and then hippopotamus in there for excitement as well. And as for all the presenters in this series, I'd like to thank very much my friends and colleagues who have helped me with images and with putting together this presentation. It's certainly a large exercise and wouldn't be possible without a collaborative approach. And I guess I've always thought this was my particular difficulty working as a comparative pathologist, but it's certainly been reassuring to me to know that even people that work with domestic animal pathology on a regular basis still have trouble occasionally identifying what's going on or what the organ is. And I think when you're working with exotic species, that's particularly true because sometimes we have trouble actually recognizing normal structures, and I've put a few of those in this presentation, things that are quite commonly described as abnormalities by graduate students when in fact they are the normal anatomic structure of a particular species. So I'm going to start off with the amphibians, as I mentioned, and we're going to start with the anurans and primarily focus on the anurans. And the first thing I have here for you is a very photogenic Cuban tree frog, but what I want you to notice when you look at this slide is that we have a bilaterally symmetrical lesion, and it looks like the window shades are half closed. We've got a white thickened area on both eyes, and this is lipid keratopathy, and this is actually an experimental creation of lipid keratopathy by feeding these frogs high dietary lipid. But this is a problem that's seen in a variety of anurans and in fact seen in a number of reptiles as well, and it appears to be associated with high lipid in the diet. This is a progressive disease, and at this point in time one would make the diagnosis of lipid keratopathy versus some kind of keratitis because there's no evidence of inflammation present in the remainder of the eye. Although given time, these cases will also develop quite a prominent keratitis, and at that point it might be difficult to tell whether it's lipid keratopathy or whether it's corneal scarring. This is a Puerto Rican crested toad, and this is showing a lesion that is extremely common in amphibians, and what we're looking at is really just the reddening of the skin in this area. So it's a hyperemia or an acute dermatitis or erythema. And this is the condition that's classically been called red leg, not when it's on the back of the neck, but when it's on the leg in frogs, and has been been traditionally associated with Eromonas hydrophilus septicemia and bacteremia, but in fact there are a variety of bacterial infections that can cause this, and Eromonas is simply recognized more commonly. So these animals can have areas of erythema on the ventrum, on the legs, or on the dorsum as we see here, and these may progress to ulcerations, and they're often associated with systemic infection at the same time. So some kind of bacteria, most predominantly gram-negatives, but certainly some of the gram-positive organisms can do the same thing. And you would also have to have as a differential diagnosis ranavirus infection, which can also cause acute viremia and epidermal necrosis and epidermal ulceration. Many of these animals will die in the acute phase of disease with the systemic infection, but some of them, like this New Guinea tree frog, may go on to heal. So in this case we have epidermal or cutaneous ulceration, but we also have regeneration. And if you have a look at this, you can see that we've got multiple areas of ulceration, but we can see that we've got a regenerative response around the margins of this. And this is really unusual. If this were to be an infectious condition, as I mentioned, many of these animals will die due to the bacteremia, but it's important to recognize that in amphibians the cutaneous surface or the skin is extremely delicate, so animals are very susceptible to damage associated with rough handling or handling by dry hands and abrasions, to contact dermatitis associated with chemicals or other materials that are put into their exhibit areas. So ulceration may in fact be traumatic in initial induction, but secondary bacterial or even fungal infection is also very common. And just on the topic mentioning ranavirus, there is a syndrome that's been seen in British and European common frogs with the more chronic ranaviral infection, where they do in fact have cutaneous ulcers rather than the acute viremic phase. This, as I mentioned, can go on and be more severe. This is another green tree frog, and we're looking at the back of the frog, and this is in fact the pygostyle that's sticking out through an ulcer. So this animal had an ulcerative dermatitis, and then this has progressed to osteomyelitis of the pygostyle, associated probably with trauma initially. All dermatitis is not bacterial or viral. This is a Puerto Rican crested toad, and it's a little hard to find granulomatous lesions on a lumpy frog, although this is looking rather suspicious down here. But what I really want you to notice is this large discolored area through here, which is dark and is thickened, and could easily be described as a necrotizing dermatitis or a regional necrotizing dermatitis. In fact, this is a mycotic dermatitis in this frog, and it's caused by pigmented fungus, so this is chromomycosis, in this case quite extensive through the skin, but these might also be multifocal, and they're generally associated with multifocal lesions in internal organs as well. So what you see on the skin is often mirrored on the inside in these. And there are a variety of fungi that can be associated with, but the pigmented fungi are extremely common for this. And this could also be differentiated, particularly if you've got the nodular lesions with some kind of a parasitic dermatitis, and there are a number of organisms that can cause cutaneous nodules. This is a Wyoming toad, and if you look at it, we've again got the hyperemia on the toes, which make us wonder whether we've got a bacterial infection. But the second thing that we have going on here is a thickening and a discoloration of the epithelium. So we have epidermal hyperplasia and probably some degree of ecdysis or persistence of the epithelium. And this is an animal with chytridiomycosis caused by Batrachochytridium dendropatitis, and I think everyone's probably familiar with that as a worldwide disease that's been implicated in the decline of amphibian species and has been certainly seen in North America, including United States and Canada. Central America is an important cause of declines of Panamanian frogs, unseen in Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, and also in Southern Africa. And this appears to be a disease that has likely spread, and the candidates have been considered as bullfrogs or African clawed frogs or Xenopus laevis. And in conjunction with a variety of other factors is probably one of the most important things in terms of amphibian declines in some areas. Lesions are often quite subtle, but it is epithelial hyperplasia and this dysecdysis that's most commonly seen, and how that translates to the death of the animals isn't clearly understood. This is a golden frog, and this is showing a very non-specific pathologic finding. This golden frog has ascites or hydrocoelum, and he's filled up with fluid. You can see the distension. Many of these frogs will also have subcutaneous edema, and this is an end rather than a cause, and this can be related to a variety of things. Anything that interferes with water and fluid balance can result in this disease, so cutaneous lesions that interfere with water absorption or water control, renal lesions can do it, cardiovascular disease, disease of the subcutaneous lymph hearts, which are involved in pumping fluid back into the vascular system, but as well ranavirus and certain bacterial septicemias such as flavobacterium have also been associated with this disease. So I think it's a very non-specific and common pathological finding in a variety of anurine amphibians. This is a White's tree frog, and as you can see, he's upside down here. These are the legs sticking up in the air. And what we've got here is a white parasite that's protruding from the skin. And this is subcutaneous parasitism by the sparganum stage of a pseudophilidian tapeworm or cestode. And these are tropical region species. So again, many of the animals that we see in captive collections have in fact been imported from the wild or from collections or production systems in other countries, and can be carrying a range of parasites that we might not normally see in North America. And this parasite has a definitive host in a carnivore, and then has a primary cycle through copepods, secondary host in a variety of species, including amphibians. And that's what we're seeing here. And these are actually, humans can be the secondary host for these as well, and people can in fact become infected as well by eating raw amphibians. So there's yet another reason why you might not want to eat raw frogs. This is a toe or the foot from a Suriname toad, and what we can see on the tips of the toes are multiple nodules, and these could be a number of things. They're fibropapillomas in this case, but we could have difficulty differentiating them from multiple small fibromas, or in fact from granulomas that might be mycobacterial or fungal. And in fact, in another species, in the Japanese fire-bellied newt, there's a papilloma virus that results in papillomas that eventually may turn into squamous cell carcinoma. So there are a number of things that may be going on. In fact, these are probably, in this case, probably traumatic induced, so they're from abrasions in the housing and then a proliferative or papillomatous response at the end of it. There are also a number of protozoan-like fungi that can cause lesions like this, such as dermocystidium, dermosporidium, or dermomycoses. This is the backbone of a frog along here, vertebral column coming down the middle, and this is showing a normal anatomic feature. And what we're looking at here are the endolymphatic sacs, and they're running along here, and these are connected in at the level of the middle ear. So embryologically they're connected with the inner ear, and these would be similar to otoliths. So they arise from between the sacculus and the utriculus, and the system surrounds the brain and then extends down the vertebral column with these little sacs at each intervertebral disc. So not everything you see that's white and discrete is going to be a granuloma. There are some structures that can look like that. This is an axolotl, so we're looking at one of the caudata here. And what you need to recognize are these large nodular and coalescing pale areas. So we have multifocal and probably granulomatous because of the size of them, hepatitis and pneumonia. And when we look at these species, if you look at a lesion that is sort of large and as solid as this, you have to think about etiologic agents that take some time to develop the lesion. So in general, we're not going to be looking at the acute bacterial septicemias. This is a case of mycobacteriosis, and we see a variety of mycobacterial species in amphibians, primarily those associated with water and soil, and often they're in as opportunistic infections. So husbandry factors, temperature factors are going to be very relevant in which organisms can take hold and then how rapidly they can grow, since temperature is often a limiting factor in the growth of many of these organisms. So in this case it's mycobacteriosis, and these will be granulomatous. Part of the coloring and the mottling comes from the fact that amphibians and also reptiles have melanomacrophages that can be associated with inflammation and increase in number in those situations. So you can get a lot of dark mottling because of an increase in melanoma-macrophages, as well as the white areas associated with other types of inflammatory cells. Rule-outs or differentials for this, as well as the mycobacteriosis, would be chlamydia. Chlamydophila pneumoniae has been identified in a variety of amphibians, and chromomycosis again, or some kind of fungal infection, would be of a more chronic duration. So these would be lesions that would take some time to develop. If we contrast that with this frog, which is a New Guinea tree frog, and in fact if we look at this, what we have in the liver are large areas of acute necrosis, and in the lung as well. So we've got multifocal, again, coalescing hepatic necrosis and hepatitis, and this is much more likely to be bacterial in origin, and we're looking at the gram-negatives again. This one was Chrysiosporum meningosepticum, but there are a variety of organisms which could cause this. Aeromonas is again the type species. But we're looking at Flavobacterium or Citrobacter or a number of other organisms. And again, Chlamydia, Chlamydophila could perhaps be considered as well. So more of a septicemic and generalized disease, and one would expect a higher mortality in this as compared to the more chronic diseases. This is a tiger salamander, and just knowing the species should give you one idea of what kind of disease you'd be looking at. We have got some epidermal necrosis, although it's a bit hard to differentiate with the irregular coloration of this animal. And what we've got as well are multifocal hemorrhages on the serosa of the stomach here and on some of the other viscera. So we're looking at, again, a more acute process. And in this case, we're looking at a ranavirus infection, so in the family Iridoviridae. And high mortality has been seen in a variety of frog species as well as tiger salamanders with a number of ranaviruses. ATV virus is the one that's been identified in the group of tiger salamanders that this one came from, and that is an acute viremic disease, as I mentioned, and with the necrosis in multiple organs and the hemorrhage that we see here. So if someone shows you tiger salamanders with high mortality or with necrosis and hemorrhage, then you want to make sure that you think about ranavirus infection. This next slide is from a Suriname toad, and this is again just to make you or get you to remember that common things can occur in any species, so simple things. This is a frog with a volvulus and infarction of the gastrointestinal system, so we've got a gastrointestinal accident, and in fact in the anurans it's not uncommon to find intussusceptions, volvulus torsion, a variety of intestinal accidents. And these have been attributed to overeating, incorrect diet, internal parasites, and enteritis, but often they seem to occur with no obvious predisposing factors, or at least none that can be recognized on the necropsy. This is a photograph of a northern leopard frog, and again a northern leopard frog should ring a bell, and if you've got a mass lesion like you have here in the caudal coelomic cavity in the position of the kidneys, then you really have one diagnosis, and that's a mesonephric renal carcinoma or renal adenocarcinoma, and that's associated with a herpes virus, rhanid herpes virus 1, and that's called Leucase tumor. And this was identified or described first in 1934 as a viral-induced neoplasm of the northern leopard frog, and this is the only species that's affected. And these are actually very interesting in that they're not transmitted to adults, they're just vertically transmitted, and the prevalence increases and decreases with season and temperature. So renal adenocarcinoma in a northern leopard frog associated with herpes virus and called a Leucase tumor. This is a Bell's horn frog, and this is the back end of the Bell's horn frog, and this is just, as I mentioned, that things fall out of frogs that probably shouldn't. So this is cloacal prolapse, and it's common for the bladder to prolapse from these animals, but it could be an intestinal prolapse or uterine prolapse in a female. And a variety of predisposing factors are again proposed for these: impaction, obstruction, internal parasitism, hypocalcemia, but it's really poorly understood. And you will also have animals that can actually prolapse from the other end, so they'll sometimes vomit their stomachs out. So you can have organs that should be inside, outside in certain of these species. And the last amphibian that I want to show you is this one, and these are two tadpoles. These are white-lipped tree frog tadpoles, and these are partway through metamorphosis, but if you look at this one where the front legs should be coming out the gill slits, we have nothing. And in this one we've got one short leg and one leg that's really not developed as well. So this is amelia, or lack of limbs, or limb dysplasia, and this is a metamorphic arrest. And spindly leg syndrome, as it's called, is a common problem in tadpoles that are raised in captivity and probably in the wild as well, with a variety of etiologies proposed, including nutrition, perhaps vitamin A deficiency, genetics of breeding small populations of species in captivity, trauma during the metamorphic stage, and of course environment and toxicity, so water quality and chemicals and other products in the water, but it's poorly understood. As an interesting aside, you can actually create polymelia, or it's been identified polymelia in association with infection with certain trematode metacercaria at a particular stage of development. Riberoia is the genus. So these guys are quite susceptible to changes in all sorts of environmental conditions that can result in developmental abnormalities. So that's a quick run through some of the amphibians and some of their more common diseases. And I guess if you spent much time in Australia, you can think about the amphibian as a disease in an environmental situation. This is a cane toad, and most Australians actually don't like their cane toads this much. So this would be an unusual photograph of someone with their favorite cane toad as compared to the cane toad that they'd rather not be having in their country. So we're going to move from the cane toads, or from the amphibians, into the reptiles and sort of shift species and types of lesions a little bit, but there are a number of similarities between the reptiles and between the amphibians, which we should have in just a second. Here we go. So again, I'm going to cover several of the orders of the reptilia and talk about a number of diseases that are present in them. I'm going to start off with the testudines, or the chelonia, and by this we mean turtles and tortoises. In North America, we tend to refer to turtles that live in the water as turtles or water turtles. Terrapins are animals that go in and out of the water and on land, and the sea turtles we tend to call turtles, but this isn't true worldwide. So if you go to Australia, for example, there are differences in what constitutes a tortoise and what constitutes a turtle. So it's important to recognize that those are common names that don't have universal acceptance throughout the world. This is probably one of the more common diseases that we've seen in small freshwater turtles over the years. And I don't know if anyone remembers the days where you used to go to the grocery store, buy a turtle, buy a little plastic turtle dish. It had a moat around the outside of it. It had an island with a plastic palm tree, and you fed your turtle hamburger and lettuce, and it didn't live very long. And it ended up looking like this. So the top of a turtle is called the carapace. The bottom of a turtle is called the plastron. And these are skeletal structures that are then covered by a thin, heavily keratinized epithelium in the form of specialized scutes or scales. And what happens when you feed hamburger and lettuce or some other combination of inappropriate food items is you have osteopenia and skeletal malformations. So this turtle here has got a collapsed plastron. He's turned upside down here. This one has got a collapsed dome in the carapace. So calcium deficiency or calcium phosphorus imbalance and osteoporosis and metabolic bone disease are extremely common in these small, particularly the carnivorous and aquatic turtles that are fed incorrectly. On the other side, we can see the lesion that we've got here, and here's the vertebral bodies across here, and these are aorta and major arteries, and we've got focal white areas here, almost annular, and this is aortic mineralization, and this is what we'll see with overzealous supplementation with vitamin D3, so almost the other end of the spectrum, or potentially in association with nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism and systemic mineralization. So this is a reasonably common lesion to see in these animals and can be quite widespread. Staying on the theme of nutritional diseases, this is a bit of a small fuzzy turtle. We can tell he's a young turtle because of the size of the shell versus the size of the head. But if you look here, you can see that the eye is out of proportion, even if it is, I'm sorry, a little bit fuzzy on this one. And this turtle is showing the classic signs of vitamin A deficiency. And what that results in is squamous metaplasia of a variety of epithelial surfaces, particularly the conjunctiva and the palpebrum, but within the ear and in other locations as well. Squamous metaplasia, and again you can see the tremendous swelling here, results in inflammation secondary to that, often secondary bacterial infection. In general, these little turtles probably don't have the best environmental situation and are not as immunologically competent as we might hope them to be. So they'll get a conjunctivitis and bacterial infection and then often an ophthalmitis as well. So this is quite common, and it's often seen in sort of 1 to 2 year old small turtles, because if they had been if the parents had been properly fed, there should be vitamin A stores in the yolk sac that will run out over a period of the first 2 years once the reserves of the animal are used up. And as I said, this is often seen in association with calcium deficiency and a variety of other dietary issues, but vitamin A deficiency and this palpebral squamous metaplasia is extremely common in these guys. Here's another turtle, and if you look at this one, this is again an aquatic turtle, we can see these punched out lesions on the carapace, and again a rimming in this case, sort of a thickening around there, giving this some chronicity. So this is a chronic ulcerative dermatitis, or more commonly known as shell rot, in this turtle, and these are likely initiated by some kind of a husbandry problem, so we associate them with inadequate environment and improper immune system or immunologic function, abrasions, or environments that perhaps are not as sanitary as they could be. And so any dermatitis that we get in these areas, because the epidermis is so thin and sits immediately on top of the bones of the carapace, generally extend into osteomyelitis. And when we have multiple focal areas like this, then we assume that we've probably got infection in these, and we've probably got internal infection associated with it. So it may well be systemic bacterial infection, and granulomas through the rest of the body in association with this as well would be common. As a more acute lesion, this is a Chinese soft-shell turtle, and this is, we're looking from the underside, so here's the underside of the carapace. They have a very reduced plastron, which would be down here, and there's the back leg coming off. So what we have here are multifocal areas of erythema, but if you look especially here, also of necrosis. So we have got a dermal infarcts, and these are most likely associated with gram-negative bacteremia, endotoxemia, endotoxin-mediated vascular thrombosis, and then infarction. And again, they're multiple, suggesting a systemic process, and again, probably involving multiple internal organs at the same time. So this would be an acute change, and if these animals live for long enough, what we may see is something like this in the red-eared slider, where similar lesions have become inflammatory and primarily infectious. So what we have are multiple heterophilic granulomas, or areas of epithelial ulceration and inflammation. So granulomatous dermatitis in multiple areas. You can see them on the foot here, and then around the face, and he may well have some vitamin A palpebral problems going on at the same time. And these could be a variety of bacteria, again most prominently gram-negatives, and generally of environmental origin. This is a red-footed tortoise, and head up here, tail at the bottom end. And what we're looking at here is the phallus of the tortoises. Tortoises have a single phallus. Here's another example of another tortoise. And what we have here is paraphymosis. So we have protrusion of the phallus, and then we have edema and congestion. And often in these, this will progress to infarction and necrosis of the phallus. And this is a reasonably common condition found in tortoises, with a variety of potential causes or etiologies. The ones that I've seen have often been associated with trauma during breeding activity, but inflammatory chlorositis can also lead to result in prolapse, neurologic signs, or straining associated with enteritis, perhaps associated with entamoeba infection or some other bacteria, salmonella, or with pinworms oxyurus species. So a variety of poorly understood potential etiologies, but again, paraphimosis and then eventually phallic necrosis associated with infarction and vascular compromise. These are the lungs and liver from a hawksbill turtle, so from a sea turtle. And what we have here, it's a little bit hard to tell because it's very wet, but we have multifocal pale nodular areas. And again, in the liver, we can see multiple pale nodules. And this is a multifocal granulomatous pneumonia and hepatitis. And with the reptiles, you're pretty safe to go for granulomatous in most conditions because anything that any animal that survives long enough to give you an inflammatory response is probably going to be granulomatous. And whether it's strictly macrophages, like we might see with a mycobacterial infection, or whether there's a heterophil component to it as well, in general, the reaction is going to be a granuloma. So this is a granulomatous pneumonia and hepatitis. In this case, this is associated with Mycobacterium marinum. So this is mycobacteriosis. And again, a variety of environmental mycobacteria can be involved in these processes, either soil or water organisms, in this case with a sea turtle. And again, potentially immunosuppressive events may have a role in how well this develops and spreads. This is a green sea turtle, and I just wanted to include a couple of pictures of sea turtles. This turtle, as you can see, has multiple nodular cutaneous lesions, and found on the flippers, probably on the face, and on several areas as well. And this is a papillomatous lesion, or cutaneous fibropapillomatosis, and this is associated with herpes virus, fibropapilloma-associated turtle herpes virus. And this is a problem seen in wild sea turtles, and it can be quite high in certain populations and can become very debilitating if they're severe enough, and can be associated in some animals with internal lesions as well. So the true significance to the population isn't understood, but in some individuals it can be highly significant. Another disease that's seen in a variety of sea turtles, including the green sea turtles, and often in association with papillomatosis, is this one. And what we're looking at is the inside of the heart, so we're looking at the endocardium. And you should be able to notice two things. First off is that we have organisms here. So these are spirochid trematodes. Liridius liridi is the species in this particular case, and this is from a recent article in Vet Record. And we can also see a proliferative change on the endocardium. So we have a parasitic endocarditis, and these are Digenean trematodes found at high prevalence in a variety of sea turtle species. The true significance is not really known. These parasites will lay eggs into the vascular system, which will flow downstream and then end up in a variety of organs and result in the creation of granulomas associated with them. And some of these granulomas are associated with fibropapillomas, so there's been some loose association made there. But the significance to the animals isn't really understood, but it is a fairly common finding in these sea turtles. All right, so we're going to shift from the chelonia, or the turtles, and we're going to go into the serpentes, or the snakes. So for any of you who aren't keen on looking at snakes, you maybe want to look away for a few minutes. And my first snake slide actually cheats because we have a lizard in there, but we have on the top here a common boa, and then on the bottom I've got a green iguana. And what I wanted to show in this case was disecdysis, or abnormal shedding. And as you probably know, a snake would normally shed starting at the mouth and then would peel backwards so that the entire shed skin would be removed in one inside-out replica of the snake, whereas you can see in this particular case that we have areas where we do have shedding, but we have large areas where the skin is retained. And over the eyes, which we really can't see here, we've got the skin retained over there, or the spectacle retained there as well. So this is disecdysis, and this is not a specific clinical sign. It can be associated with abnormal environment, temperature, humidity, but most often with a snake that's not in the best health. This iguana is here because I wanted to just mention that that lizards don't shed all in one piece in general. They'll shed in sections, so you wouldn't expect to find an inside-out lizard shed, but you'll find these patches which they'll often eat, so you may not even find them. In this case, we've got a retained area, so we can get disecdysis and retention of the shed in lizards as well, and that can be significant when it's on the feet because it can act as a constricting band, and then you'll get vascular infarction and loss of digits, or dry gangrene in the digits associated with that. So disecdysis in both snakes and lizards. One of the complications that we can see with disecdysis is what's shown in this image, and this is a king snake, and what we have is a panophthalmitis, and often this is secondary to disecdysis or retained spectacle. So even when the snake sheds the entire skin, sometimes we have a remnant of it, or the spectacle, which is the sort of the goggle that sits over the cornea that can remain. And then this gives a space between the corneal surface and the spectacle called the subspectacular space, where fluid and bacteria can accumulate, and then an infection can develop, and that can progress through the cornea into an endophthalmitis. So what we have here is a caseous or heterophilic or probably granulomatous endophthalmitis associated with a retention of a spectacle. The next few images are kind of how to get the skin off snakes when you don't want to. These are snakes that did foolish things. This is a common boa and then a ball python at the bottom, and these are both regional epidermal or regional cutaneous necrosis and ulceration. And you can see, in fact, we have a large area of necrotic skin here that's coming off. And in this case, we've got areas of sort of dried skin and some crusting. These are snakes that got too close to heat sources. For some reason, snakes don't seem to recognize an intense heat source. And I think the upper one curled around a light bulb, and this one was from a heat pad. So these are animals that spent a protracted period of time on a very hot source and then cause transmural thermal burns or complete epithelial thermal burns. So this is fairly common in captive reptiles if the husbandry situation isn't set up to prevent them from this access. This is another thing that shouldn't happen, and this is a Burmese python. You can see the python has disecdysis by these kind of rough areas, but what we should also see are these large areas of cutaneous ulceration. And these are regional and large, and they're associated with rat bites. So this is what happens if you have a snake, presumably either shedding or after going through an improper shed, probably not interested in eating, put in with live prey, and predator becomes prey. So this happens more often than it should and can cause quite extensive cutaneous lesions, ulcerative as you can see here. And obviously a good source of secondary infection for the animal if they're not severe enough to result in its death. This is a common boa, and just so you're not confused, this is a damp paper towel sitting over a portion of it, but what you can see here are large areas of the snake that are denuded of epithelium, and this is regional epidermal necrosis, known also as splitting skin syndrome. And in this condition, which is thought to be associated with vitamin A toxicity, but that's certainly by no means proven. We have large areas of skin which peel right off, and presumably this is an infarctive process, otherwise we'd have more hemorrhage associated with it. This can be seen in snakes, but it's also been described in some of the larger tortoises associated with injections or large injections of vitamin A. And obviously, depending on the amount of skin that's lost, the animals may are going to have problems with fluid and electrolyte balance, and then also with secondary infection. On a more sort of chronic situation, again, we have a lot of things that reflect internal lesions in snakes. This is a Massasauga rattlesnake, and this is the ventrum of the snake. And if we look at it, we have a variety of lesions in the ventral scutes. Here we have an area where we've got ulceration. So we have necrosis and ulceration, so a necrotizing dermatitis, multifocal. We've got areas with some scarring, areas with discoloration. Here's another small scar over here. So we have multifocal ulcerative or necrotizing dermatitis with scarring, and this is probably associated with secondary bacterial or with bacterial infection and bacteremia and shedding of bacteria and small infarcts or small granulomatous infections. And probably we have similar lesions through the viscera of this snake if we opened it up and had a look at liver and lung. These are probably gram-negative, again, chronic bacterial infections, and we'll often think about husbandry factors as being involved in immune system and having a role to play in whether these clear up or whether they go on and develop into lesions like you can see here. So that perhaps is an inside-out lesion. If we look at an outside-in lesion, if you look at this section of skin from a tiger snake, and what we've done here is, this is the skin peeled off, laid down on a table sort of inside out, and then folded over. So you're seeing the outside of the skin here, and then the inside of the dermis here. And what you should notice on the outside, we can see here and here. So these are ticks, and these are Aponoma ticks species. And what we have here is, you can see some necrosis along there. And then if we look on the underside, we've got granulomatous dermatitis. So we have granulomatous dermatitis in association with ectoparasites, in this case ticks. And you can see this kind of pattern associated with mites as well. Mites are very common in snakes and lizards. Again, environmental issues perhaps play a role in that. And then they can introduce a variety of disease organisms, including bacteria. In this case, it was a streptomyces. And we've got the granulomatous lesions associated with that. This is another section of skin from a snake, and you can see we've got a large nodular lesion here which looks necrotic. When we look at that in cross section, you can see that we've got a large area of ulceration, but we have inflammation extending down into the dermis and then into the muscle. So we've got a granulomatous dermatitis and then myositis associated with cutaneous ulceration. And this has been going on for some time, obviously, as evidenced by the amount of reaction here. And this was in fact mycotic disease. I don't know what the organism was, but environmental fungi are common secondary invaders, and this may well have been an initial traumatic injury to the skin and then a secondary mycotic infection after that. And then the last sort of skin thing I want to show you is this section, which is from a tentacled snake, which is an aquatic snake. So these snakes live in the water all the time. And as you can see, we have what looks like somewhat normal epithelium here, but we have a very thick and opaque epithelium, and this is dysecdysis, as well as an inflammatory dermatitis with inflammation extending into the shed skin, which is partly what's holding it together. And this is associated with a fungal organism called Nanesiopsis freesii. And this was initially identified as a cause of disease in chameleons and has also been recognized in bearded dragons as casually called yellow fungus disease, but we saw it in these snakes, and this is a fungus that lives predominantly in the keratin layer but can extend down into the epidermis and results in what look like reasonably sometimes kind of simple or more often complicated lesions associated with the dermatitis, but in this case, because these are aquatic snakes, having a fairly severe impact on their water. The next slide we have is from a ball python, and this is the front, and again we can see we've got an area on the very rostrum of necrosis, epithelial necrosis, but if we look in here, we've got a necrotizing stomatitis, and on this one we can see that we've actually got quite a bit of deformity of the animal's face. So this is necrotizing stomatitis, and it's probably associated with osteomyelitis because these infections often progress down into the bone. These are often thought to initiate with trauma to the front of the face, so animals bumping into the glass or scraping their face on the substrate of their caging, and then secondary bacterial infection extending into osteomyelitis, and these can be quite severe. This is another snake. I'm not quite sure what it is with the mouth open, and you can see the choanal slit on the roof of the mouth. You can see the glottis here at the base, but what you should notice is that we've got a nodular mass here, multinodular mass that's protruding through the choanal slit, and this is a choanal polyp. But you could easily confuse this with a granulomatous reaction, so either inflammatory associated with mycobacteriosis, for example, and I've actually seen a lesion very much like this in an alligator snapping turtle that was shot in the mouth with a shotgun and sort of had foreign bodies and continually erupting granulomatous inflammation associated with that looked somewhat similar. So this one is a polyp, and reptiles can develop a variety of neoplastic conditions, particularly in situations like zoo and private collections where they can live much longer than what would be their normal lifespan in the wild. This is a king snake, yellow rat snake, and we've got it opened up in the oral cavity here, and what you should be noticing are large numbers of nematode worms through here. This is infection with strongyloid nematode Callicephalus, and this is actually an intestinal nematode, but when these snakes have been dead for a while, things can wander around, and in fact these nematodes have worked their way up the esophagus and they're leaving the sinking ship. And this is just a reminder for me to say something about autolysis. Many reptiles, how can I put this politely, rot for a period of time under their heat lamps before they're recognized as being dead. So it's not uncommon to have a fair bit of autolysis associated with lesions in reptiles that can make sort of identification of lesions a little bit more difficult, and in this case can result in seeing parasitic species in a place where they don't belong. These would, as I said, normally be in the intestine and can be associated with enteritis in large numbers. This is the lung of a snake, which you can see has kind of a thin respiratory surface surrounding a very large lumen, and what we have sitting inside of the lumen are pulmonary pentastomes, and there are a variety of pentastomes that have been identified in reptiles, in snakes, crocodilians, and also in lizards. And in fact, the majority of pentastomes are of reptile origin, and they come from a number of species: Armilifer, Rallitiella, Chirocephalus, Sabichia, and crocodiles, Porocephalus. So there are a number of these. The reptile is the definitive host, so these would pass eggs in the feces, they would ingest the secondary host, and then the parasites would crawl through the intestinal wall or the gastric wall into the lung, where they'd finish up to carry out their life cycle. In this case, we have a little bit of hyperemia, but the lung is predominantly normal, but you can get areas of ulceration and then perhaps secondary bacterial infection associated with the locations where the parasites are attached onto the wall of the lung. This is another snake with, again, pulmonary pentastomes and coelomic pentastomes in a much larger number. But what I wanted you to notice here is the catarrhal inflammation, or the increase in mucus production associated with the lung. So we've got a very wet-looking lung with a lot of exudate here. And these are Armilifer organisms, so whether it's secondary to the pentastome or something else going on, but we'll get secondary bacterial infection, increased mucus, we can get fibrin present as well, and then a proper pneumonia developing. Here's another snake pneumonia. This is from a Burmese python, and this one is much more fibrinous. We can see areas of fibrin. There's probably some hemorrhage, and again, there's increased mucus production. Fibrinous pneumonia or severe pneumonias in snakes, you always want to also think about initiating factor of Ophidian paramyxovirus infection, which can cause pneumonia in a variety of species. Initially, this was identified in the viperids, but it has been seen in a variety of other types of snakes and can be pneumonia on its own, or can lead to secondary bacterial infection and then more severe fibrinous changes. So this is quite a severe fibrinous and catarrhal pneumonia in a snake. Similarly, another snake lung, and you can see again large amounts of mucus, but what you should be able to identify amidst the mucus are these organisms here. So we have a variety of very small nematodes, and these are Rhabdias, a strongyloid nematode, which has a direct cycle, so you can have parthenogenic females, but also a free-living phase. And like as in other species, these can come through the skin, but eventually migrate to the lung to complete their life cycle. With large numbers of these, we can have clinical signs associated with irritation to the lung, increased mucus production, and secondary infection. So catarrhal pneumonia, I suppose, would be perhaps how I'd call this, because what really the lesion is an increase in mucus production, although on the cellular level there may be more inflammation present. And I believe this was in a garter snake. This image is from the literature, from a vet pathology paper, but I included it because it's such an absolute gorgeous image. You can see the outside of the lung. Snake lungs are long and tubular, and then the inside here. And what you've got is a granulomatous pneumonia, and this is a mycobacterial infection. Potentially it could be fungal as well. And in fact, the people that did this paper were finding Chlamydophila pneumoniae and chlamydia-like organisms in a number of granulomatous pulmonary lesions in snakes and lizards, and also in some chelonians. So I think Chlamydophila has to be a differential for granulomatous pneumonia or granulomatous inflammation in these species, the same way it was in the amphibians. But just a classic photograph. Switching from lungs to stomachs, or to the GI tract. This is a stomach from a common boa, and we have a lesion which is associated with the presence of Cryptosporidia, Cryptosporidium serpentis in this case, and we have gastric mucus metaplasia, and in some cases ulceration, increased mucus production, and thickening of the stomach, and in fact sometimes to the point where the entire snake looks like it has a thickened body wall. This results in abnormal digestion and vomiting and regurgitation, and then the animals will lose weight and become emaciated. Cryptosporidia are also found in the intestine of skinks and a number of lizards. Cryptosporidium saurophyllum has been identified in the skink, and there may well be several other Cryptosporidia, or else we just don't understand the spectrum of infection. But this is one of the classic snake lesions, so this gastric mucal hyperplasia and mucus metaplasia of the stomach in a snake. So that's something that you should be able to recognize and key into the fact that it should be cryptosporidiosis. If we move a little bit further down the intestinal tract, this is a garter snake, and what we're looking at is, you can't quite see the tail, but this is the colon. So we've got a fibrinonecrotic enteritis or colitis in this case, and this is associated with salmonella. So although we think of salmonella in reptiles as often reptiles being carriers, and the identification of salmonella from a culture as not being of significance, in fact salmonella can cause enteric lesions in reptiles as well. And whether this is a particularly virulent strain of bacteria, or whether the animal was immunocompromised in some way, and that's resulted in infection, it's hard to know, but certainly it can be a clinical disease in reptiles as well as simply existing in the carrier state. Same basic end of a snake, you can see the cloaca right here, and again a fibrinonecrotic colitis. We've got some urates present as well, and this is a case of Entamoeba invadens. Entamoeba invadens is a commensal, or certainly a common organism found in the colon and feces of aquatic turtles, but when transferred to snakes can cause extremely severe lesions. So a necrotizing colitis in a snake, you want to think probably about Entamoeba invadens first, and then Salmonella as a second most likely candidate. This disease, the Entamoeba, can also occur, so I've seen really severe lesions in tortoises, so red-footed tortoises, yellow-footed tortoises, and then organisms can go through the intestinal wall, invade through, and you end up with necrotizing lesions in the liver or elsewhere in the animal as well. So not strictly a colitis, it can become a systemic disease. This is the cloaca of a snake, so we're down at the back end here. I think this is an emerald tree boa, and what we have is cloacal prolapse and cloacal mucosal necrosis. So this might be seen in association with a necrotic colitis, like the last two cases that I've shown you. Can also be associated with cloacitis, egg laying in the females, problems with egg binding, or breeding and other reproductive problems, such as paraphimosis in the males. So again, just a little bit of a cloacal prolapse, and then a necrotizing cloacitis that we can see here. These are the viscera of a snake, and this is a wild-caught mangrove snake. And what we have, you can see a number of small sort of nodules or structures, round structures here. And these are coelomic metacestodes, so wild snakes or snakes in the wild can be involved in a variety of parasitic cycles. So they can be the definitive host for some organisms, or they can be a primary or secondary or paratenic host for others. And it's really difficult and really impossible to know where they fit into the cycle. But we can find incidental lesions like this in a variety of wild-caught animals. And without knowing sort of who the definitive carnivore is, it's probably difficult to know what the who the parasite truly is. This is a mangrove snake, again another wild-caught snake, and just as a reminder, wild-caught captives, we get a variety of diseases. You can see we have a large nodular lesion here. It looks to be fairly consistent in texture. We don't have evidence of necrosis or of inflammation around it, and in fact this is a histiocytic sarcoma in the liver of this snake. So long-term captives, we can see neoplasia that presumably wouldn't likely happen in the wild. Some of these have been suspected to be associated with retroviruses, whereas others are simply incidental findings. And I suppose you could try and consider a large granuloma as a differential diagnosis, but because of the very uniformity of the texture in this, I think that that's probably much less likely. This is the kidney of a snake. In snakes, everything is long and thin in order to fit into the snake, but if you look at this, you can see that we have multiple pale nodules. And although superficially these look a little bit like the sarcoma, there are multiple of them. So again, if we have multiple nodules in a reptile, we're probably going to think about granulomatous inflammation. And the most common cause of granulomatous, or one of the most common causes of granulomatous inflammation in a reptile or an amphibian is going to be Mycobacterium species. So this is hepatitis, not nephritis. And so Mycobacterium marinum, Chelonia, Thamniophis, avium, even Mycobacterium TB have been identified, but generally they're soil organisms. And again, they're severe and disseminated. These sections are from Massasauga rattlesnakes, and this is associated with a project. And as you can see, we have something with a little number here, and this is an intracoelomic radio transmitter. So one of the things that people can do when they're trying to study snake biology is to surgically implant coelomic transmitters, and then they can follow the snakes. So this is one that went well, and this is one that went badly. And this seems to be quite a common complication of the procedure, particularly when it's done without ideal sterile conditions. And you can see the transmitter here is surrounded by fibrinous material, so we have a fibrinous coelomitis, and you can just kind of see here the wire extending subcutaneously and associated with a fibrinous cellulitis through there. So we've got a sort of a localized fibrosing coelomitis, I guess, in this one associated with a foreign body, and in this case where we've had secondary bacterial infection, we've got a fibrinous inflammation. And again, these are a variety of organisms that would probably be coming in as opportunists associated with the surgical wound perhaps not being cleaned or the animal being released into the wild before the surgical wound was healed. That looks a little bit like what we can see in the next slide, and in fact it isn't. These are decomposing eggs. So snakes will lay eggs. The eggs will be in the oviduct, and presumably they should pass through it at the appropriate time. But if we have a salpingitis, so bacterial infection within the oviduct, or if we have environmental conditions that perhaps result in the snake not being willing to pass the eggs, then we can get these infections. So we have a fibrinous sort of decomposing eggs with a fibrinous coating that are associated with a fibrinous salpingitis or oviduct infection. Now we're on kidney. Again, a long linear organ again, but what I want you to see here are the areas of hemorrhage. So we've got some focal areas of hemorrhage, we've got very prominent vessels, and then we have these little white speckles all through the renal ridges along the renal lobules. And what we have here is acute urate nephrosis, and this is a classic example of gentamicin toxicity. So we've got acute tubular nephrosis and uric acid deposition, and this might well be associated with hyperuricemia and then urate deposition on other surfaces. So gentamicin is the classic way to cause that in reptiles, particularly dehydrated reptiles. We contrast with this, which is again a nephritis, and a urate nephritis or neurite nephrosis, but in this case we've got sort of granulomas or nodules, and you could be easily confuse this with a granulomatous nephritis, which is what it is, but in this case the granulomas are induced by the presence of uric acid spicules rather than by infectious organisms. And in animals that develop hyperuricemia, whether it's due to dehydration or some other disease process that goes on for a period of time, you're going to end up with a combination of sort of heterophil macrophage multinucleate giant cell granulomas, and you'll get swelling of these sort of renal, I guess not lobules, but of these sort of wedges, and swelling, hyperemia, and then this increased inflammatory reaction. So that's going to end up the snakes, and then we're going to move on and look at some lizards. And some of the lesions are similar in the Sauria, whereas we also have a few different things. This is the classic green iguana presentation. If the turtles lived with their little ponds and their lettuce diets, well, the green iguanas initially were kept as pets and were also fed like iceberg lettuce. And what often ended up was you got guys that looked like this. He's got a necrotic stomatitis that you can see here, but he also has a gross deformity of the jaw, visible in the front on this one, and then a very undercut short jaw on these, and if you sort of squeeze them a little too hard, you'd find that their bones are very soft. So this is metabolic bone disease, or nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism associated with calcium deficiency, and what we have in the head and in other bones is a fibrous osteodystrophy. So they have these short, thick heads. And then if we look at other parts, they have what the owners describe as nice thick legs, but when you look at this, you can see there's the bone in the original cortex, and then what we have is massive fibrous osteodystrophy, which will mineralize if the animals are given calcium later, but it's going to give you this extremely thick, expanded cortex. So this is associated with inadequate dietary calcium most often, or potentially and especially in species like chameleons where we have inadequate a broad spectrum lighting, so they can't convert vitamin D to active form of vitamin D3, and therefore we have hypocalcemia associated with that. So, and then nutritional secondary parathyroidism and potentially renal problems as well. This is another green iguana that kind of has a short fat face, but in this case it's because we have a focal lesion and it looks like we've got some exudate in the nostril, and this is an abscess. So we have a focal caseous or heterophilic lesion and probably a cellulitis associated with it, or a bacterial abscess, and probably that was traumatic in origin, either through the skin or potentially through the dental arcade. And if we open this up, it's filled with a sort of a caseous material that would histologically have both heterophils and macrophages associated with it. Somewhat related, and again following a pattern we've seen in some of the other species, in this lizard we have multiple skin nodules. You can see where the scales are sticking up, and these would be multiple subcutaneous granulomas. There's probably some necrosis associated with them as well. And again, this is the kind of lesion that we see with a chronic bacteremia, and then localization and small abscesses developing in multiple tissues. So trauma, mites, ticks as external parasites, or simply associated with bacteremia. Here's another lizard, and this is his open mouth. This is here's the lower jaw and the tongue, and then the upper jaw, and you can see that we've got a necrotizing lesion here with caseous and fibrinous material. So we've got a necrotizing stomatitis, and in a lizards, particularly this kind of sort of chuckwallas and that type of lizard, we've seen a number of these where they've had herpes virus lesions initiating this. So we've got a herpes viral stomatitis and then secondary bacterial infection moving in on that. So that's probably a combination of things in these species, and there are quite a few herpes viruses. PCRs are being a bonanza for identifying new viruses of all kinds, and seems to be particularly herpes viruses in reptiles. So it's going to take some time to figure out which ones are pathogenic and how significant they actually are in the development of some of the lesions that we see fairly commonly. This is a monitor lizard, and just to green tree monitor, and just to give you a comparison, again you can see the bottom jaw. We've got a necrotizing lesion here involving the edge of the lip, also proliferative. And this could be a granulomatous inflammatory lesion, but in fact it's a squamous cell carcinoma. So again, neoplasia can occur, and in this case this animal's been treated with radiation, so we've got more necrosis than we would probably have had initially, simply with the neoplastic process going on. These are the viscera from a beaded dragon, and again here's the liver, so we've got hepatomegaly. And then we've got miliary white foci through here. They look like they've got a bit of an inflammatory reaction or hyperemia around them. And this is again a granulomatous hepatitis. This case is again mycobacterial, but it could in fact be bacterial of some other kind. So in these, again, these lesions can be chronic, and it's often difficult to tell without histology what the inciting organism is. But it's certainly multifocal granulomatous hepatitis. This is a green iguana, back end. We've got the cloaca here, intestine coming up there, bladder, and these are the kidneys. So similar to what we saw in the snake, we've got granulomatous nephritis, and associated with uric acid crystals or small stones. So we've got urolithiasis or renal lithiasis, as well as granulomatous nephritis in this case. And severe renal disease has been associated in these guys with potentially very high protein foods. So we saw a lot more renal disease, hyperuricemia, urate nephrosis, when people were feeding cat food and other high protein carnivore diets to iguanas, which should be folivores, so they should be eating large leafy green things instead of high protein cat food. So granulomatous nephritis and urate nephrosis in a green iguana. Associated with that, if they're hyperuricemic, like you've seen in some of the probably seen in bird sections, we've got uric acid frosting on the surface of the heart here. So we have visceral gout on the epicardial surface, and potentially in other locations. This is a foot from a frilled lizard, and we've got periarticular uric acid deposition. Uric acid in tissues is always very irritating, so if we have uric acid, then we're going to have inflammation. So this would be a heterophilic cellulitis and periarticulitis. Or if it had been there for any period of time, then it would be heterophilic and granulomatous. I guess the differential diagnosis for this would be a condition known as calcinosis circumscripta, which has been identified in lizards, again in periarticular locations, in some chelonia and in Uromastyx livers. But in this case, it's articular gout associated with increased uric acid levels. Another iguana, again here's the cloaca. What you need to notice here is we've got a very large viscera that seems to be taking up a lot of space, and in fact this is an animal with cloacal or with renal disease. You can just barely see the kidneys, but compressing the colon, causing obstruction, and then we've got a megacolon in this case associated with that. So we've got colonic obstruction due to renomegaly. And we see this with renal disease, but we also see it with colonic strictures. And whether this is similar in pathogenesis to the renal strictures that we see in pigs associated with salmonella, I'm not sure. But it's colonic impaction secondary to some kind of obstruction in the pelvic inlet. And the kidneys in iguanas are extremely distal, so it's not unknown for graduate students or anyone who hasn't necropsied a lizard to actually not be able to find the kidney because they're not looking far enough back. So they can obstruct very caudally in the colon. Again, here's another back end of the green iguana. Again, large, pale, swollen kidneys, so this animal's got renal disease. But what we're looking at here is the bladder. Many lizards and chelonians do have bladders. It's very enlarged, and it's filled with this kind of creamy, milky looking pale material, and this can be just calcium. So like rabbits, we can have large amounts of calcium sludge in some of these animals depending on what their diet is, but we'll often have urinary lithiasis or cystic lithiasis, so we've got stones in there as well, and the calculi are often either calcium or potassium urate stones, and whether this is dietary in source associated with an imbalance, we're really not sure. is another animal with the bladder, and you can see in this case we have got a large urolith, so we've got a big stone. But if you look at the inside of the bladder, you can see along here that we've also got a fibrinous cystitis. And in this animal we likely have a bacterial infection of some kind, so whether the uroliths developed secondary to infection or whether the reaction in the bladder was secondary to having a urolith present, or cystolith present, it's difficult or impossible to know, but certainly both can occur. And this is a frilled lizard, and again we have liver, intestines. In this case we have a fibrinous coelomitis, and so we will see fibrinous lesions. Not all of them are granulomatous, or else they're fibrinous in combination with granulomatous lesions that are probably present in here and certainly will occur if it lives for long enough. These would likely be bacterial, and we've seen these associated with perforating wounds or an enteritis and then enteric perforation, and then we have peritonitis and bacteremia associated with that, or rupture of an abscess. So we can see a more classic peritonitis in reptiles. It's just less common than the more discrete granulomatous changes that we see. Again, these would most often be gram-negative infection or gram-negative organisms identified. This is a monitor lizard, and showing the oviduct and the various eggs through here. So just to remind people that most reptiles have got 2 oviducts, unlike birds, and they can have very large numbers of eggs. When they ovulate, the eggs will stay in the oviduct for various periods of time depending on the species and the environmental conditions. So simply seeing eggs in the oviduct of a lizard doesn't necessarily mean that it's egg-bound the same way it would be if you saw this many eggs in the oviduct of a bird. It may simply be that it hasn't gotten to the appropriate time or the appropriate environmental conditions to lay the eggs. However, egg binding could be. There may be lesions or there may be disease associated with it, but just because you see a lot of eggs doesn't mean you shouldn't look for another lesion that might be causing the animal to be ill or to have died. Okay, lizards onto crocodiles. So we've got a few crocodile sections to look at, or a few crocodile slides. Back to basics, similar thing, multifocal necrotizing dermatitis, and in fact diffuse necrotizing dermatitis along the jawbone. So again, gram-negative infection. Eromonas is often also being a common organism in crocodilians associated with endotoxemia, and then multiple infarcts that may go on to be multiple abscesses if the animal lives long enough with that. Environmental issues, temperature, hygiene of the environment are probably very important in the development of this kind of lesions. This is a classic, and this is mesenteric fat. You can see the trachea coming down and the abdominal organs and the abdominal fat. It has a yellow color. When we look at it closely, we've got large areas of the fat bodies that are yellow and kind of irregular in color, and then up here we can see we've got a hyperemic border around them. So what we have is fat necrosis and steatitis, inflammation around it, and this is vitamin E deficiency. So this is a classic lesion of vitamin E deficiency in crocodilians fed rancid fish or fed high fatty fish that have been in the freezer too long, and we've had antioxidant strain and we've lost the vitamin E. So these guys are vitamin E deficient, and then we have necrosis of the fat or steatitis. So a classic crocodile lesion. I wanted to show you this because it's a little bit different than what we see in the other reptiles. This is the lung, although you'd be forgiven for thinking it was maybe an air sac from a bird. And what we have is a mycotic pneumonia, so we have granulomatous pneumonia with fungal plaque. So this could be Aspergillus, Fusarium, Beauveria bassiana. So a number of fungal organisms have been associated with it, but you can see these large cavitated lesions with the fungal growth on the surface of it. So mycotic pneumonia in an alligator, American alligator. And this kind of fungal pneumonia with the large fungal plaques is much less common in the other species of reptiles in my experience. And this is more the classic granulomatous lesions, granulomatous pneumonia, so you can see caseous material, and it also looks like we have quite extensive catarrhal increased mucus production, so kind of granulomatous and catarrhal pneumonia, I suppose, if you wanted to sort of call both aspects of this. And this is in a false gharial. And this is mycotic rather than mycobacterial, but I think you could certainly be forgiven for thinking this might be a mycobacterial lesion, although if you look at the centers of these, they do have that sort of dark appearance that you more often see associated with the fungal infection. My last crocodile lesion is one from a recent publication, and I'm not quite sure, I don't know that polka dot disease would really go over as a proper morphologic diagnosis, but that's really what it looks like. And these are lymphohistiocytic proliferations in the skin associated with West Nile virus in farmed alligators. And this is known as ice pick disease, which I think is quite suitable. And this is, as many of you are probably aware, West Nile disease has been identified as a cause of lesions and mortality in alligators, and it looks like reptiles can also act as amplifiers. So that's the end of the reptile session, and just a reminder that many of the diseases that we see are associated with husbandry, temperature, proper care. So if you want to have happy, healthy reptiles, you need to look after them properly, like I'm sure this young lad is doing. So moving along the evolutionary tree, we're going to go from reptiles. Hopefully we're going to go from reptiles and talk about birds. And as I mentioned, I'm going to be focusing primarily on the psittaciforms, or the parrots, and really in the context of what we would see in the pet bird situation. So psittaciforms, or parrots. And we're going to start with this guy, and this is a kind of a nice classic example of a bird that looks pretty pleased with himself, although I don't think the owners are so pleased with him. And what we have is alopecia, starting very nicely from the neck down, and this bird's done a lovely job of basically pulling out its feathers. So this is loss of the covert and the down feathers, and this is psychological feather plicking. And I've got this in here because it's important when we're looking at feathering in birds to decide what's been done by the bird and what might have been done by a disease agent, because although it's fairly obvious in this case that we have a really nice line between normal and abnormal, if a bird is not quite so thorough, then we can get irregular patchy loss, damage to feathers, and it can be much more difficult in some cases to tell whether the bird's doing it to the feathers or whether there's an underlying problem with the feathers. So if we contrast this macaw to these little peach-faced lovebirds, initially looking at these are just developing their first feathers. If we look at these areas, we've got sort of abnormalities, irregularities in their feathering on the back. Their tails are looking a little bit spiky. If we look at the feathers close up, we've got what we need to identify are the fact that we have a feather dystrophy. So we have in these feather shafts, we've got narrowing of the necks, we've got pinching off, and we've got abnormal development, which could be chewed on as well, but in conjunction with these dystrophy and some of these funny feathers that actually look a little bit more like hairs, we've got a true feather dystrophy. So in a parrot with a feather dystrophy, you want to think about one disease, and that's psittacine beak and feather disease, which is psittacine circovirus 1 and 2. So this is an example of beak and feather disease. And they call it beak and feather disease because it's not just only the feathers. So here's a Moluccan cockatoo, and we can see that we've got fracture of the beak, so we've got necrosis of the rhampotheca, or the covering of the beak, on the top and on the bottom here. And so dysplasia, necrosis, and these birds can develop severe beak lesions as well associated with the disease. So beaks, feathers, and then the third thing that we see in association with circovirus are bursal disease. And this image is actually not of an atrophic bursa, it's of a bursa from a parrot, but it's to remind me to talk about it that in young birds with beak and feather disease we have bursal necrosis, and bursal necrosis in an early stage in development obviously is going to have an impact on the development of the bird's immune system and make them more susceptible to other diseases such as polyomavirus. So when we have young birds that mortality or illness in young psittacine birds, we often think about circovirus as perhaps an underlying factor involved in whatever disease it is that we're identifying. So it's always important to look at bursal size and bursal development in these psittacines to see whether we have evidence of circoviral infection or psittacine beak and feather disease. This little guy is a budgie, and I've got him in here because cytosine beacon feather disease is not the only reason for abnormal feathering. And again, he's got lack of feathers, so he has feather dysplasia and feather aplasia here. And this bird has polyomavirus, which is also called budgie fledgling disease, which can get a bit confusing when you put the acronyms for the names. Polyomavirus can result in high mortality as a viremic disease in young birds, but particularly with budgies, the survivors can be these little guys with permanent feathering abnormalities, and they're called runners, which is obvious, they run, they don't fly, or French molt, which I presume was a name given to them by the British. And so you'll see this. So if you see this kind of thing in a budgie, think about polyomavirus or budgie fledgling disease. If you see it in a larger cytosine, then think circovirus or cytosine beacon feather disease. Two different syndromes in the different groups of cytosines. This is also a classic disease, one that we don't see as often anymore, but it's a proliferative dermatitis. We see it on the cere area around the nostrils. Budgies, especially canaries potentially, around the eyes and on the feet. And this is a parasitic proliferative dermatitis caused by Nematocopptes pilae mites, or cutaneous acariasis, and rare to see a disease this severe nowadays, but certainly before ivermectin it was quite common to see fairly severely affected budgies. Contrast with this Amazon, and this has got a catarrhal rhinitis. So this bird has got an exudate coming out of the nostril. We can see some grooving and abnormalities of the beak associated with that. We've got some feather loss on the face as well. And this is a bird with chronic sinusitis. So this should alert you to consider things going on inside the sinus cavities. Birds have got extensive sinus cavities, and in fact air space is extending up through this into the skull and into the bones of the head. So if we have a bird like this one, which was a blue-fronted Amazon parrot with a 25-year history of sinusitis, and we're starting kind of at the front and then sectioning through, you can see all of these kind of yellow areas here, through here, a little bit in here, and again up here. This is a fibrinous and heterophilic cellulitis, so this is a bird with chronic sinus infection, and a variety of bacterial organisms were identified from this as well. There's extension up into the bone, and this bird had mycobacteriosis and the osteomyelitis as well, so I'm not quite sure how the two were related. But chronic sinusitis in cytosine birds occurs and perhaps maybe secondary to vitamin A deficiency in the initiating stages where we have problems with epithelial and sinus health. So it can be very severe and chronic. This is an African grey parrot, and this is showing severe signs of vitamin A deficiency. So again, with that we have squamous metaplasia of glands and salivary glands in and around the oral cavity, so underneath and around the tongue, and this is actually just sort of underneath the jaw, and these will develop into caseous lesions with accumulations of keratin and then secondary infection and cellulitis going along with it. So squamous metaplasia and then heterophilic or granulomatous cellulitis in association with that. And what you often see with these as well, which I haven't got shown here, is blunting of the choanal papillae, so of those little pointy papillae, that sort of stalactites that surround the opening to the choanal slit in birds. Those will be blunted and often have inflammation associated with them. On the theme of oral lesions, we can see vitamin A related lesions, but what we can also see are the disease we have in this bird. This is the lower jaw. Here's the tongue for orientation, the upper up here. The glottis is somewhere in here, and what we have is a proliferative lesion around the opening of the glottis. And then when we go down the esophagus, we can have multiple proliferative lesions along the esophageal mucosa. So this is papillomatosis or papillomatous disease, oral and esophageal papillomas, and in cytosine birds these have been associated with herpes viruses. So herpes virus 1, cytosine herpes virus 1 and cytosine herpes virus 2 predominantly. Amazons and macaws particularly, but in a variety of species, and these will get progressively larger as the birds age. Maybe in association with cloacal papillomas, so they tend to go together as a syndrome. And with a period of time, this disease has been associated with a higher prevalence of hepatic and pancreatic neoplasia, so bile duct carcinomas and pancreatic carcinomas. So there's a linking of those with the herpes viruses. Some of these papillomas are thought to develop into squamous cell carcinoma as well, given time. This is a cockatiel, and this is the crop, the inside of the crop here. It's a bit hard to get oriented. This is heading into the thoracic inlet. This is where the shoulder girdle has been cut off. And what we have is a proliferative mass here. And this is in fact a squamous cell carcinoma of the mucosa of the crop of a cockatiel. And we've seen these in a variety of species located in the crop, or more commonly at the opening from the esophagus to the proventriculus. But really looking at this section, it would be a bit difficult to tell this from some kind of a sort of a proliferative caseating lesion or an abscess at the site as well. Here's a budgie, and this is a bit of an oldie but a goodie, not a disease we see that often. We can see here that we have a crop full of seeds, which might not be too bad. But when we come down here, and I'm sorry, it's a really old slide. Somebody else put the arrows on with felt pen, but what we have is thyroid hyperplasia, or goiter, and then compression of the esophagus as it comes through here, and then stasis of the crop, or impaction of the crop. Thyroid hyperplasia is used to be a fairly common lesion in budgies fed unsupplemented seed diets, so seed diets with no additional iodine. And these birds would sometimes show gastrointestinal signs like the one here, but more often they'd have change in voice because of pressure on the syrinx and pressure on the trachea as it goes through there, so they'd have a clicking noise or a change in voice. So iodine deficiency goiter, hyperplastic goiter, in budgies, that's really the only species that we've seen it in. Staying within the esophagus and crop, this is obviously not a parrot, but it's a really good lesion, and I know that these have been shown in other series looking at game birds and chickens. This is a budgie, and we can see in this case transmural lesions. So these are trichomoniasis. So this is a caseous ingluvitis, necrotizing, or caseous stomatitis in this case, and ingluvitis meaning the crop, and you can see transmural in this case with necrosis extending through the wall of the crop. So Trichomonas galleni is the most common one, not that common in psittacine birds, but can be found, and certainly seems to be more common in budgies than in the larger species of psittacine birds. This is a baby macaw, just to set the scene. And what I want you to look at in these lesions, so we're looking just kind of above the sternum, so in the area of the crop, we have an area of discoloration of the skin, and then we've got some necrosis of the skin. And this is a thermal burn, so we have cutaneous necrosis. And in this case, given time, we end up with a crop to skin fistula as these start to heal. Most baby psittacines are hand-raised, so the owners would incubate the eggs artificially or pull the eggs from the nests, and then they would heat up a liquid, semi-liquid food for them and then feed them. And if the food is too hot, the birds chug it right down, it sits in the crop, and then you end up with necrosis of the crop epithelium. And if it's hot enough, then transmural necrosis and necrosis of the overlying skin as well. Which, if it's not extensive enough to kill the animal initially, will pop in about 10 days, and you'll have a fistula like this that could be surgically repaired. So crop burn and then secondary fistulation associated with healing. So this would be the more acute lesion on the left, and then on the right we have the fistula in the healing stages. Two birds, psittacine birds again, and you've got heart and liver and lung, and what you need to identify here is the outline of the proventriculus, the isthmus, the ventriculus. So this bird, and there's the grinding muscle, the ventriculus. This bird has an enormously dilated and distended proventriculus, isthmus, and ventriculus, and when we open them up, this one's not quite as distended, but we can see that they're filled with poorly digested seed and poorly digested food. So this is proventricular dilation disease, and this is a classic disease that's been seen in psittacine birds for a number of years. We've thought about this in terms of considering it to be a viral etiology, and just in the last year there have been several papers that have come out suggesting an avian-borne virus as the cause for this, and that certainly seems logical. So we're looking at this as probably a neurotropic virus that affects the ganglia of the mesenteric plexus and results in dilation and malfunction. This is my famous pile of dead birds slide, and this is what I used to talk about viral diseases of the liver. And the most classic example of this is Pacheco's disease. So we have multifocal acute hepatic necrosis and splenic necrosis associated with cytosine herpes virus or Pacheco's disease. But we can see the same lesions with polyomavirus in a young bird with systemic necrosis, and often more hemorrhage with that. And in fact, in budgies, we've seen this with reovirus, which has been recognized as a syndrome, and there's been a few publications on that recently. So Pacheco's disease, acute multifocal coalescing necrosis, classic kind of a herpes viral lesion. If we look at this, this is a young cytosine bird, and this is polyoma, and this is the other example where we've got the multiple hemorrhages associated with viremia. If we opened this bird up, we would probably have lesions in the liver and the hepatic necrosis as well with it. Spots, on the theme of spots on livers, you've seen a number of these when in the avian section, but we have again multifocal hepatic necrosis. We may have fibrinous air sacculitis. We'll have fibrinous pericarditis in some of these cases, and splenitis, fibrinous perihepatitis. So this is Chlamydophilus psittaci, so a classic triad of hepatitis, splenitis, and air sacculitis in these birds. Recently there have been papers, a couple of papers on Coxiella-like organisms as causing a sort of pathologically almost identical syndrome. So it'll be interesting to see how many of the chlamydia cases that we couldn't identify organisms in actually turn out to be a Coxiella-like organism. Quick slide just to remind you that birds do not produce large amounts of bilirubin, they produce biliverdin, so we don't see jaundiced birds, but what we do see is biliverdin excreted in the urates. So we'll see green urates like this in a bird that has hepatic disease or has hemolysis in comparison to what we might see as jaundice in a pet bird. These are classic examples if you would have seen in any avian pathology. This is avian mycobacteriosis, which in birds as compared to mammals is an enteric disease. So the classic is to have granulomatous enteritis, as we can see here, with then systemic spread. So granulomatous hepatitis, granulomatous splenitis, and in birds often lesions in bone as well. So we may have granulomatous osteomyelitis, Mycobacterium avium, Mycobacterium genevense are the two most common organisms that we see. But Mycobacterium tuberculosis has been identified in pet birds from humans to birds, and probably some other organisms as well. But those. Hi, welcome back to session 3. I'm Dale Smith, and this is Zoo and Exotic Animal Pathology. So we're halfway through and working our way through the phyla. We're talking about diseases of cytosine birds right now. And the one that I've got for you to start off with is a picture of the intestinal tract of a cytosine bird, and as you can see, it's jam-packed full of nematodes, ascarids, in this case possibly Ascaridia columbi. So we don't see enteric parasite infections that commonly in cytosines that are kept as individual cage birds, but when you move into outdoor groupings, particularly in more southern climates where birds can live outside, then we have the potential for a variety of parasites as we would for any other species, and ascarids are one of them. In this case we have an ascarid impaction. I've also seen intussusceptions associated with heavy ascarid burdens in the absence of treatment, and presumably they could occur after treatment as well. So intestinal nematodiasis associated with ascarid infection in a cytosine bird. Next slide is again, you can see the heart here, the coelomic cavity, and we have what looks like a necrotic mass up in near the vertebrae, and then sort of a thickening and fibrosis of the peritoneal surfaces. This is an ovarian carcinoma that was associated with chronic fluid accumulation in the coelomic cavity and then fibrosis of the coelomic membranes. In pet birds, we do see a number of of neoplastic processes. Again, they can live 20, 30, 40, 50 years or more. Ovarian neoplasia is fairly common. Ovarian cystic disease associated with fluid accumulation, oviductal tumors as well. And some of these can cause peritoneal or coelomic carcinomatosis, the way is often seen in chickens, but not necessarily. So a variety of neoplastic conditions similar to those in a variety of other species could be seen in aged pet birds. Coming right down to sort of the end of the bird, this is the cloaca. So you're looking in the cloaca and you're looking at a proliferative cloacal mucosa. And here you can see the mucosa actually protruding through the opening to the cloaca. These are cloacal papillomas, and part of the papillomatous disease complex that we see. I showed you the pictures in the upper GI tract, and then we often see that in association with the lower GI too, with these cloacal papillomas. And again, this is in association with cytosine herpes virus, probably 1 and 2. And these can be extremely large and proliferative to the point where they're obstructive. If they become ulcerative, then a secondary bacterial infections and ulcerative cloacitis can occur. This needs to be differentiated from cloacal prolapse. And here again, we have a large pink mucosal mass protruding from the cloaca. So whether this is actually proliferations off the cloacal mucosa or whether it's the cloacal mucosa itself differentiates between whether it's a papillomatous disease or whether it's cloacal mucosal prolapse. We'll see mucosal prolapse in association with straining, either reproductive or GI disease, but also as a syndrome in sort of 5 to 6 year old male cockatoos where they appear to have problems with cloacal muscular tone. This is the cloaca of one of these birds, and it looks very much like the cloaca of a laying hen in that the cloaca is very flaccid and the opening is enlarged. In this case, there are 2 metal sutures that have been placed to try and keep the edges together so the bird won't prolapse the cloacal mucosa out through the opening. The cause of this is not understood. It's probably hormonal, and we've wondered a little bit about relaxin. Estrogen levels haven't appeared to be elevated. That would have been the obvious first thought, since it so much resembles what we see in laying hens under high estrogen drive. Speaking of hens under estrogen drive, what we have here are obviously egg binding or eggs that have been stuck or retained in the cloaca, and in this case prolapse of the oviductal mucosa. So in birds that are calcium deficient and become static or go into egg binding associated with hypocalcemia as part of the process, or whether they have an abnormally large, abnormally formed egg, or an egg with a rough surface associated with an inflammatory lesion in the oviduct, these birds can become egg-bound. The egg can become stuck basically in the distal oviduct or in the cloaca and can prolapse eventually with the cloacal mucosa, or can result in constriction and compression on the ureters, inflammation, and potentially renal failure secondary to that. So as a complication of abnormal laying by hens, mature hens. We saw visceral gout in reptiles, and visceral gout in birds occurs commonly. We have a thick layer of uric acid on the surface of the heart, so epicardial urate deposition on skeletal muscle, on liver, so on a variety of organs. And this is just a small image of polarized uric acid crystals. If these are present for any time, then they will induce an inflammatory reaction, a heterophilic reaction initially, and then eventually granulomatous, and these are what are known as urate tophi. You saw the more chronic granulomatous ones in the reptiles. In birds, an extensive uric acid deposition doesn't usually let the bird live long enough to develop a really severe granulomatous reaction. These are the feet of a couple of psittacines, and perhaps a passerine here, and what we've got are nodular, periarticular, subcutaneous depositions of uric acid. And again, these are going to result in inflammation, so we'll have a heterophilic cellulitis and periarthritis that can be quite painful for the birds, and associated with elevated uric acid levels or some kind of metabolic issue involving uric acid. These are often not the birds that have got acute renal failure, rather, but there's something else that's causing them to deposit uric acid, perhaps in some similar to some of the mechanisms in humans. Looking at the respiratory tract, here's the trachea, syrinx and the division into the primary bronchi, and as you can see we have a white material and exudate here, so this is a syringeal granuloma in a parrot. This is a good spot for organisms to collect. It's an area of narrowing and of turbulence, so organisms can deposit out on the surface of the syrinx, and particularly it appears to be fungal granulomas, so we'll see that in especially African grey parrots, but other psittacines as well. But you can see foreign objects here, particularly cockatiels who seem to like to aspirate seeds, and then they'll plug down here where the trachea begins to narrow. So a syringeal aspergillosis in this case, but it could be a bacterial infection potentially as well. This is an endoscopic view of the air sac of a bird, and what we have is a focal granuloma in the center, and then we have fibrinous and or fibrous extensions into the air sac surrounding it, and you can see the increased vascularization in the air sac up here. So this is an air sac granuloma, and this could be mycotic or it could be bacterial. Just a reminder that mycobacterial disease in birds is generally enteric to systemic and not a pulmonary disease, so this would be unlikely to be a mycobacterial disease, but it could be caused by a variety of different organisms of other types. Here is a parrot, heart, liver, air sac, and lungs. And the lungs are extremely dark red. We've got some focal, pale, or slightly orange areas. And down in here we've got large amounts of fibrin, and you can just kind of see in the opening there a little bit. This is a fibrinous air saculitis or granulomatous pneumonia and air saculitis. And this large pale area here is our fungal plaques. So this is a mycotic pneumonia. Aspergillus species are the most common, and it can be extremely severe, almost like a brooder pneumonia, as would be seen in chicks. So we may just have focal granulomas, or we may have the whole full-blown fulminant disease occurring like we see in this case. A reminder that even though pet birds have been pet birds for many years, we don't always have the diet down right, and particularly when people are raising young birds on a homemade diet, we can have dietary problems, and again, calcium deficiency is the most common. This is a cockatiel with rickets, so nutritional osteodystrophy and abnormal ossification of cartilage, or normal cartilage development and ossification. So rickets in birds, young birds particularly, on an abnormally balanced diet. And on that topic, this is the heart and major vessels from a parrot, and you can see the thickening and irregularity of the walls of these arteries, as well as a yellowing color. So this is arteriosclerosis, or atherosclerosis rather, and this is a common finding in older psittacine birds that have been raised on high-fat diets, particularly on seed diets for long periods of time. And these birds may have cardiac disease resulting from this, or acute cardiac failure under stress, because they've got such narrowing and lack of compliance of these vessels that they can't tolerate an sudden increase in the need for exercise or for cardiac function. So those are my psittacine slides, and I hope that gives you a little bit of a range of the sort of pathology that we see in psittacine birds. Again, the basic principles are similar to that for poultry or anything or any other avian species, but the specific diseases tend to be a little bit different. I have one or two other avian things that I wanted to show you that tend to be diseases of captivity. In this case, these are the feet of a peregrine falcon, and you can see we have bilaterally symmetrical ulcerative pododermatitis, chronic, and this tends to be a problem of captivity where these birds are not kept on the appropriate surfaces. We get small abrasions, secondary bacterial infection, and then cellulitis and osteomyelitis. You can see by the amount of swelling in the feet that we've got kind of a chronic and substantial problem going on, and these can be extremely severe and extremely difficult to deal with in a clinical situation. So ulcerative pododermatitis, cellulitis based on the swelling, and probably osteomyelitis as well based on the anatomy of the feet. If someone were to show you a picture of a myna bird and a liver and put the two of them together, then the disease that should come to mind is hemochromatosis or iron storage disease. And in this case, we have hepatomegaly, hepatic and perihepatic fibrosis. I've snuck in a few histologic sections on this one, but this disease is a classic for miners, and it's associated with a level of iron in the diet that is much higher or much more available than would normally be available to these species in the wild, which results in enormous accumulations of iron within the hepatocytes, necrosis of the hepatocytes, and fibrosis. And with a pearl stain, you can see the immense amount of iron that's present. So mina birds and liver and hemosiderosis, iron storage, should be linked in your mind. Another couple of linked diseases. This is a lady Gouldian finch. This is what they're supposed to look like. And this one has got, obviously, a conjunctivitis and heterophilic or suppurative. I don't like the term suppurative for birds. And this has been associated with passerine herpes virus 1, passerine herpes virus 1, seen in Gouldian finches, but a variety of finch species. And Gouldian finches are a species that has problems in the wild, and there are a number of diseases that can that have an impact on them. The other passerine disease that I wanted to show you is this disease, and this is a canary. And these are tracheal mites in the canary, so tracheal acariasis. This is actually the mite within the trachea, and this is what they look like outside. And this is Sternostoma tracheacolum is the species, and these can cause severe infestations in canaries, which can cause respiratory compromise. And we see it in the Gouldian and other finches as well, but it's a classically seen as a canary disease. So those are just a few passerid diseases that are more relating to the passerines as pet birds rather than in the wild situation. I'm going to stay within the birds, but I'm going to make a big switch of gears and talk about ratites. So we've been going from some of the smallest passerines to some of the larger birds. Before I do that, we've got, in honor of the Easter presentation, we've got some of these Easter chicks that are in multiple colors. So my question to the audience is, how do you make chicks turn out pink and green and yellow and all these interesting colors for Easter? So I'll let you ponder on that while we move on to the ratites. Now, ratites are a group of birds, and the ones that I'm going to talk about are the ones that are raised commercially. So we're talking about the ostrich, which is the largest bird, the emu down here, and the rhea. Ostriches are African, emus are from Australia, rheas from South America. And these three birds are raised commercially, and they have some interesting pathology that I'm going to show you today. Because these are raised as commercial birds, we have to think in terms of commercial raising cycles, the same as we would with poultry. So when dealing with ratites, one of the important things to consider are embryo mortalities, incubation issues, that kind of thing. So this is an embryonic death with an unresorbed yolk sac, which would help age it to some degree, and we'd have to think about the various causes of embryonic death in incubation that we would consider in poultry or any of the other commercial avian operations. So temperature, humidity, cleanliness in the incubator, turning the eggs appropriately. So all of those things would be relevant to raising ratites the way they are in other poultry operations. This is a hemorrhagic and necrotizing yolk sac from a young ostrich. And so these naval infections in birds that hatch without their yolk sac fully closed make them very prone to secondary bacterial and mycotic infection, particularly if there's been contamination in the incubator or the hatcher or in the area where the chicks go immediately after hatching. So this is yolk sac with a fibrinohemorrhagic reaction and inflammation occurring in that. This is a young emu chick, and all of these ratites, young ratites, grow extremely quickly. So we see a variety of torsional and rotational bone deformities in the birds. And this young emu, we can see we've got a valgus deformity, and we've got a slip gastrocnemius tendon coming through here. So these birds have got severe deformities associated with rapid growth, and generally, if they're severe enough, the birds cannot continue and can't eat and walk. Just as a notice, this bird is also being what they call declawed. So these are partial phalangeal amputations so that the birds can't scratch each other with their nails and thus damage and decrease the value of their hides. The birds are sold for meat, but also their hide is used for leather. These are bones from some rheas, so we have long bones and also ribs. Although there are commercial diets available for ratites, there are also a number of people who make their own. So again, we have rickets, we have calcium. In this case, it was actually phosphorus excess, but calcium deficiency rickets is also seen, where we have defective endochondral ossification and folding fractures. And you can see the folding fractures quite obviously here, and proliferation and abnormality of cartilage in those areas, and then beading and multiple fractures on the ribs. So nutritional metabolic disease or metabolic bone disease associated with phosphorus deficiency or some other kind of calcium, phosphorus, vitamin D abnormality or imbalance. Ratites of all ages are prone to eat things they shouldn't, particularly in response to changes in environment or changes in husbandry. This is the gastrointestinal tract from a young emu, and we can see we have impaction of the proventriculus and the ventriculus with grass, and then extending down and obstructing through the pylorus into the small intestine. So this is a gastric and duodenal impaction, and these birds will impact on grass or straw or shavings or a variety of substrates, particularly if there's actually been a change in that substrate. In the older birds, we'll see a variety of foreign bodies, glass, syringes, wood, stones, although one has to be careful because they will use stones as grit, so it's not unusual to find some number of smallish stones or gravel in the ventriculus used for grinding, but in some birds it becomes an abnormal appetite and they will actually impact and obstruct on foreign material, including stones. So gastric impaction, foreign body impaction, gastric foreign bodies. This is a young ostrich chicks. Ostrich chicks tend to be delicate. The mortality in all ratites is highest when the birds are young. They tend to be quite stable once they get beyond 6 months of age or so. Ostrich chicks are much more delicate and are prone to a variety of nonspecific syndromes, including something called fading ostrich syndrome. This ostrich obviously has extremely dilated loops of bowel with large amounts of fluid present. It has an acute enteritis, probably bacterial, and E. coli and other common enteric pathogens have been identified in these and can result in enteritis, bacteremia, septicemia, as they would in other species. These are the Zika from a rhea. And this is a disease that's been identified in rhea, but not in the other ratites. It's necrotizing and fibrinous. You can see the exudate lining both Zika, typhlitis, and this has been associated in rhea with the presence of a Brachyspira hypodysenteria and a Trichomonas-like organism, and causes this really severe typhlitis. A similar reaction in terms of it being a necrotizing enteritis or colitis has been seen in other ratites, particularly ostriches, associated with Clostridium perfringens or Clostridium difficile, and potentially in rheas as well. But the spirochete-associated typhlitis is a rhea disease, whereas the clostridial diseases are more broad, but potentially seen in particularly seen in the ostrich. This is one of these normal features. This is the trachea of an emu, and you can see in here there is a defect in the tracheal cartilage, and this is normally covered by a very thin membrane. And this is a normal feature. Presumably this is what allows them to blow their neck out and to make the booming noises, but it's not unknown for pathologists to write this down as an abnormality in the tracheal anatomy as compared to recognizing it as a normal finding. This is the respiratory tract from a rhea, and if we look in the trachea, we've got fibrinous exudate in the trachea, so we have a fibrinous tracheitis. We have, in fact, almost a fibrinous plug up here, and this is a bird with avian influenza. Avian influenza has been a problem in ratites in North America. It's been a big problem in South Africa, Nigeria, the Middle East. So wherever ratites are raised and poultry are raised, they're susceptible to influenza viruses, and this includes the H7N1 strains that are of the most concern right now. In South Africa, they've had a number of large culls of ostriches associated with avian influenza with a variety of subtypes. And the susceptibility to disease does not directly mimic that of poultry, which is probably not very surprising. Ratites probably become infected from waterfowl or other birds in the environment the same way that poultry does, but they can also be infected from poultry. So avian influenza causing fibrinous tracheitis in a group of young rhea, and in this case we have the proventriculus ventriculus, and in the ventriculus we can see areas of ulceration and some hemorrhage. So this was also seen as part of the syndrome. The clinical signs of influenza, or the pathologic lesions of influenza in ratites, are basically similar to those in other species. This is a bit of an odd section, but it's the respiratory tract, and again you should be able to recognize these enormous fungal plaques in an air sac, and then this is the lung, so we've got an irregular density. So again we have granulomatous pneumonia and air saculitis with fungal plaques, aspergillus, and this has been a really significant problem in mid-age juvenile animals that are being raised through the winter, particularly in indoor conditions, so associated with poor air quality and potentially temperature stress and less immunocompetence or just higher spore loads. So mycotic pneumonia as a disease of mid-range growing ratites has been seen quite commonly, more often in northern North America. This is an ostrich, and tissue from an ostrich. You can see the heart and where we've got the great vessels coming out, and we've got aortic rupture and then hemorrhage around here. And we can see this at the base of the heart, but it can also be seen further down the aorta, so in the main branch or intrathoracically. And this has been associated casually with copper deficiency, but it hasn't been recreated. And we see this in ostrich and as well in emu. So the assumption is that there's copper deficiency and abnormality in the wall of the vessels, and then rupture and hemorrhage. Sometimes these birds will exsanguinate, sometimes it's a slower, more chronic disease. This is a young ostrich, and we've got a proliferative and necrotizing lesion here, so proliferative or necrotizing blepharitis and dermatitis, and this is an avipox virus infection. Just a reminder, there are many, many avipox viruses, and they can occur in a variety of species, generally quite species specific, and ostrich pox has been identified in both the dry and wet forms. And then just to finish off with the ostrich, this is an ostrich feather. And we can see these little white structures along the base of the feather, and these are nits. And this is the adult, so this is pediculosis or feather lice in an ostrich. Species is Struthiolepurus struthianus, and these have come from Africa with the ostriches around the world, as have many of the other parasitic diseases that ratites will succumb to or are susceptible to. So this has been just a real quick brief view of some of the diseases of ratites that we see in North America and elsewhere in the world. The industry sort of went up and down, but we still have a number of ratites that are being raised, and they do have some interesting conditions. So off with the ratites. We're now going to switch from the ratites and the ostriches, and we're going to move into the mammals. And the first group that I'm going to talk about in the mammals are ferrets. So I'm going to discuss ferrets as a specific group because domestic ferret is seen as a common pet and has a number of interesting diseases and things that are somewhat unique to the ferret. So we're going to go through those for the next little while. And here is a classic picture of a ferret. As you notice, he or she has no hair on the tail. So endocrine alopecia is probably the most common disease of ferrets associated with endocrine disease associated with adrenal disease. And this can be increases in estrogens, in androstenedione testosterone, so in the androgens, and also in progesterone, and it appears to vary from ferret to ferret. So thinning of the hair on the tail and the tail head is the classic initial symptom, although you can see a ferret like this one where we've got hair on the tail, fur on the tail, but the rest of the body is alopecic. So in this case it's the trunk, and we also have a very large abdomen on this ferret, which is another ferret condition that I'll come to in a minute. This is the back end of a ferret, and we can see vulvar hypertrophy, And this can also be seen in association with ferret adrenal disease, but may also be evidence of a ferret that's in heat. Ferrets are induced ovulators, so if we have an unspayed female ferret that goes into heat, it will remain in heat if not bred, and these ferrets will produce large amounts of estrogen and can in fact have estrogen toxicity. So an enlarged vulva may be a sign of an intact ferret that's in heat or in a ferret that has been spayed, and most ferrets are spayed at 4 to 6 weeks of age. Then it's probably evidence of increased estrogen produced by an abnormal adrenal gland. Here are some images of ferret adrenals, and when we talk about adrenal disease, it ranges from a nodular hyperplastic lesion to adrenal adenomas and to something like this where we have an enormous adrenal carcinoma. So we have a whole range of benign hyperplastic to malignant diseases of the adrenal gland that can produce more or less of various hormones and produce various clinical scenarios. This is again another ferret, and this is the vena cava. We can see the kidneys in fat, but what I want you to notice here is that we have a mass within the vena cava. And adrenal carcinomas, particularly if the right adrenal gland in ferrets, the right adrenal gland naturally wraps around the vena cava, and many of these will invade through the wall of the vena cava to the point where they can actually obstruct the vena cava, and you'll have a large intravascular mass like we have here. So an adrenal carcinoma invading the vena cava in a ferret, and with secondary thrombosis as well associated with that generally. Excuse me. I mentioned that in ferrets with high levels of estrogen, we can have the vulvar hypertrophy. In this case, we also have petechial hemorrhages on the skin, and we have evidence of melena. These ferrets with high levels of estrogen for long periods of time will develop anemia, pancytopenia, thrombocytopenia. So we can see hemorrhage associated with this and evidence as petechiation or as melena. Rarely seen to this degree in association with adrenal disease, but it's the classic additional clinical signs or lesions associated with persistent estrus in unspayed females. Other diseases of ferrets, skipping from adrenals, but we'll come back to them. Ferrets are exquisitely susceptible to canine distemper virus. Most of them are vaccinated for distemper. So in a ferret like this, the same way we'd be looking at a mink or canid species, we've got a proliferative, somewhat exudative dermatitis. Then we want to think about canine distemper virus, although ferrets, because of their susceptibility to it, generally or may not live long enough to develop these lesions, but we can't see it, and there was a recent publication showing very similar lesions. So foot pad hyperkeratosis or hyperplasia of the dermal pad in ferrets that survive the initial phase of distemper and go on to develop more classic lesions of chronic disease as we might see in some of the carnivores. So canine distemper in ferrets. Ferrets get lots of other lumps and bumps, and there are some of them that are more common than others, but there are also, you can see a whole variety of neoplasms. This is one of the more common ones. This is a cutaneous sebaceous adenoma on the foot of a ferret, but that's playing percentages. It could be any other kind of nodular cutaneous tumor as well. The other neoplasm, cutaneous neoplasm that's common in ferrets is the mast cell tumor. In this case, it's been irritating and we have some hemorrhage associated with it. We have another one on the leg here. So when you're going through a differentials, you might not specifically be able to call that a mast cell tumor, although it looks like there's a little hyperemia around it, but you can certainly have mast cell as one possibility, and these can be quite variable in appearance in my experience. Black-footed ferret, this is a preputial adenoma, so these sebaceous or glandular adenomas seem to be fairly common. An apocrine carcinoma in the prepuce of this ferret. This is something that if I was looking at a mouse, I would think that it's been scratching itself and it had myobia. But in a ferret, they don't usually do that. So an area of cutaneous ulceration and dermatitis needs to be looked at a little bit differently. And in fact, this is cutaneous epithelioma, or cutaneous lymphoma rather. So we'll come back to lymphoma in ferrets in a minute, but just as an unusual display or an unusual lesions associated with cutaneous lymphoma in a ferret. This is a classic ferret lesion, and what we have is a nodule on the end of the tail, and this nodule is a chordoma, and these arise from the remnants of primitive notochord. They're also been described in the cervical spine, but the tail is the most common. They can get very large, but generally don't tend to metastasize elsewhere. So a lump on the end of a tail of a ferret is most likely a chordoma, although not always. And in fact, this is the tail of a black-footed ferret, and we've got multiple apocrine carcinomas through here. So you can get a variety of diseases or a variety of lesions, but that big lump at the end of the tail you want to think about as a chordoma. I've got some slides where we go lymphoma, 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 because lymphoma, in my experience, is the most common neoplasm that we see of ferrets. It's certainly in the top 3, depending on where you look, and I suppose that's excluding adrenal disease. So this is a popliteal node, so we have a very enlarged popliteal node in a ferret. Lymphoma would be the most common, although we have had sarcomas that could look like this as well, so your diagnosis wouldn't be made simply on the gross. This is a ferret that could have a cellulitis around the throat area, but in fact it has an enlarged submandibular lymph node, which looked like this on cut sections. So an enlarged node that's been replaced by a homogeneous pale tissue, and this was in fact a Hodgkin's-like lymphoma in the submandibular lymph node that spread systemically. Lymphoma, in my experience, is most often seen initially at the perigastric or mesenteric lymph node. That's when we're following these clinically, that tends to be the first spot that we see it, but that's not always the case, and not all ferrets are examined by ultrasound every 6 months, so picking up the first lesion is not necessarily that common. This is kind of the pyramid ferret, and it's also a bald pyramid ferret, but abdominal enlargement in ferrets is a relatively common clinical sign, and it can refer to a number of things. Obesity is one of them, and this ferret is probably obese. Splenomegaly, this is another ferret, and we can see the bluish color here associated with the visualization of the spleen underneath the skin, and drawing the lines on it. This is in fact how large the ferret's spleen actually is, so splenomegaly. But this abdominal enlargement can also be associated with neoplasia, either adrenal cortical neoplasia or metastases to liver of spleen, of lymphoma or another tumor, cysts on the liver, cysts on the kidney, or cysts on the prostate, the latter of which is associated with adrenal disease. So a number of different reasons for ferrets to have large abdomens. This is lymphoma, so again we have multiple pale focal areas in an enlarged liver with rounded edges. So there would be other differentials for this, but lymphoma for an infiltrative disease in a ferret is always a good choice. Splenic as well, so we've got a nodular lesion in the spleen with pale areas, irregular texture, and this would have a varied echogenicity on ultrasound. So splenic lymphoma, and these are from the same animal that had the submandibular lymph node enlargement. Other causes of splenomegaly in ferrets include extramedullary hematopoiesis, and this is just a very large spleen histologically that's filled with EMH. And this can be nodular or diffuse, although in my experience it tends to be more diffuse. And the reasons for and the clinical symptoms or clinical significance of this is not always known. It's referred to as hypersplenism clinically, but it's simply splenomegaly with EMH on a pathologic basis. We can see nodular hyperplasia, as you can find here, and again you've got to differentiate this from lymphoma, from some other kind of neoplastic infiltration. And the other differential for splenomegaly in the ferret would be Aleutian disease, which is not that common in my experience, but which will certainly give you splenomegaly in association with some other pathologic lesions. So as we see here, this is a ferret with Aleutian disease, and we have splenomegaly, we have splenic infarcts, we have hemorrhages on the surface of the stomach, we have hemorrhages on the surface of the kidneys, which are also rather pale looking, and we have hematuria. So this is an animal with Aleutian disease, which is caused by the Aleutian mink disease parvovirus, and has been a concern in the ferret world, and many people have evaluated their ferrets serologically for it. My experience is that I haven't seen a lot of cases, although it is certainly one of the ferret diseases that's described. Back to neoplasia and so causes of enlargement. This is a hepatic carcinoma, and in looking at both domestic ferrets and black-footed ferrets, we've seen a lot of hepatic carcinomas in many of these animals, and this one is extremely large. Hepatic carcinoma again, but what this animal also has are cysts, and we see biliary cysts quite commonly in ferrets. These often increase with age, and they can become clinically relevant and in fact replace major portions of the liver and eventually result in hepatic failure if they go on for long enough. This one was from a black-footed ferret, but in domestic ferrets we see multiple biliary cysts also as a clinical and pathological entity. Switching ends, black-footed ferret, common things are common and can be identified. Erosive ulcerative proliferative mass in the oral cavity, squamous cell carcinoma. So think about the basic kind of things that you would expect to see in any species, and then try and temper them with what you know about the specific diseases that can occur in the species that we're dealing with. Ferret, head up this way. Here's the esophagus coming down here. And the esophagus in this ferret is dilated and flaccid, and this is esophageal dilation megaesophagus. This is seen as an idiopathic condition, particularly in older ferrets, and some of these may have aspiration pneumonia in association with it as a complication, but others it may be cryptic and may simply be identified at necropsy. So same lesion as you would see in any other species, dilated esophagus, but think of it as something that does occur in ferrets. Looking at ferret esophagi, this is a syndrome that was reported several years ago as a new syndrome in ferrets. On top we have the normal tongue and esophagus. On the bottom we have one where we have atrophy, fibrosis. You can see the tongue looks kind of shrunken and wrinkled, and then we have a pallor and streaking of the esophageal mucosa. So this is a disease that affects the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and also skeletal muscle. This is normal on the right, and on the left we have an atrophic fibrotic muscle, and this is seen in conjunction with a suppurative or myositis or pyogranulomatous myositis and fasciitis in ferrets, a high mortality rate, and not sure what the cause is. There was some discussion and thoughts that it might be associated with an adjuvant and vaccination, but that has not been proven, and there's been some epidemiologic work trying to tie this in. So it came up quite suddenly a number of years ago, and I think the number of cases has been reducing again recently, and I've never seen one in Canada. Classic ferret diseases. This is the ferret's stomach. We've got thickening of the folds, we've got focal areas of hemorrhage, and what we have here is multifocal gastritis or proliferative gastritis and gastric hemorrhage, and this is associated with Helicobacter musteli. Infection with this organism is widespread. However, the degree of inflammation varies quite a bit from individuals, so whether an individual ferret actually has clinical gastritis and gastric hemorrhage probably depends on a whole variety of other factors. But certainly a common disease of the ferret, and ferrets were actually used as a model for Helicobacter gastritis in humans. This is a finger caught, a latex finger caught, and this is just to remind me to mention that ferrets like to eat rubber and foam objects. So gastric foreign bodies in ferrets or pyloric obstruction is something quite common. So vomiting ferrets, regurgitating ferrets, ferrets that are anorexic, foreign bodies can be identified, and often they're foam, insides of cushions, earbuds, in this case latex. So a variety of substances like that seem to be quite popular with the ferret. Further down the intestinal tract in the small intestine, we've got large amounts of mucus and fluid. We've got what are sometimes called birdseed feces. So this is a catarrhal, diffuse catarrhal enteritis, and caused by a ferret enteric coronavirus. This is known as epizootic catarrhal enteritis or green slime disease, and is seen particularly in younger ferrets or ferrets where there's been mixing of groups and you have carriers and susceptible animals. Generally, it's a short-term disease, but you can see that we've got, in this case, some hyperemia of the mucosa and large amounts of mucus and fluid production. That's been seen for quite a period of time, but again, if we look at what's come out recently, we have a new fling on that, and this is a lymph node. So we have lymphadenitis, pyogranulomatous, and there's a bit of hemorrhage here. We can also see pyogranulomatous lesions in the spleen or liver or elsewhere, and this is very reminiscent of the dry form of FIP, and in fact ferret coronavirus has been seen associated with this, so the thought is this is perhaps like FIP in cats in that the coronavirus, certain strains may become able to produce FIP-like lesions. It hasn't been completely eliminated that there is a new strain of ferret enteric coronavirus, but I think the trend is to think that it's probably following the feline model. So a new disease that's been, or a new kick on an older disease that's been recently described. A little further down here we have, you can see colon, and we've got proliferation here of the mucosa, thickening or a cobblestone kind of appearance. And this is proliferative colitis, diffuse proliferative colitis, and this has been associated with the Desulfovibrio species, which was previously known as Lawsonia, previously known as Campylobacter-like. And so we've got a proliferative chronic colitis. And we can also see sort of proliferative thickening bowel associated with inflammatory bowel disease, either in the small or large intestine. So those tend to be the more chronic enteric diseases as compared to the coronavirus, which is more of an acute and a sort of fluid and catarrhal enteritis. Another common disease of the ferret, this is the pancreas adjacent to the duodenum. We have a nodule here, so pancreatic endocrine tumor. And when these are functional, they generally produce insulin. So our assumption is that most of these are pancreatic insulinomas. And they may be multiple, and as I said, they may or may not be secretory. So a nodule in a pancreas of a ferret is likely an insulinoma, but on the safe side, it's a pancreatic endocrine tumor. Ferret kidneys, renal cysts, multiple renal cysts are common in ferrets and can sometimes increase in size, but are often incidental findings. Until the last few years, I would have said ferret renal disease wasn't actually that common, but we've had a whole run of them. So we've seen a number of ferrets with chronic renal disease, sometimes in association with cysts, as we have in this case, but we also have thinning of the cortex, sometimes areas of fibrosis, prominent glomeruli where we have what looks like glomerular sclerosis. So in this case, the medulla looks fine, but we can have some cortical atrophy, and in this case, cysts. Here's another one where we have a bit more of an irregular appearance to the cortex, some thinning of the cortex in areas, and this pallor, and you can see sort of raised and irregular. So we have chronic renal disease with renal cortical atrophy, with scarring, with glomerular proliferation, giving us some of that bumpiness. So seen primarily in older ferrets, not associated with as much lymphoplasmacytic interstitial infiltrate as we'll often see in some of the other carnivores in my experience. This is a surgical image, obviously, and we're looking at the prostate. So these are multiple prostatic cysts, and we see prostate hyperplasia and multiple prostatic cysts in association with ferrets that have adrenal disease, and not necessarily in association with any particular hormone elevation. So these ferrets can have urethral obstruction or abdominal megaly, abdominal distension associated with the presence of large numbers of cysts. They can also get bacterial infection, so although the cyst wall for some of these looks quite clean, we do have some material in the base of it, and these can be inflammatory, and they can be associated with prostatitis as well. So suppurative prostatitis and often suppurative cystitis in association with that. This is the thoracic, these are the thoracic organs from a ferret. We have the heart and lungs, and this is an example of a ferret with cardiomyopathy. About 10 or 15 years ago, cardiomyopathy was extremely common in ferrets, and we feel that it may have been associated with low taurine in the diets. People were feeding ferrets often cat food of poor quality, As ferret foods of better quality have become available, the incidence of cardiomyopathy and cardiac disease has become much less. Ferrets tend to have a rather globose, round heart to start with, but with these ferrets it's even more so, and will either have dilation or have hypertrophy. It's often associated with marked pleural effusion, so having pulmonary atelectasis that can be extremely severe is generally involved as well. And with chronic disease, we can also have chronic passive congestion of the liver, so we can get that classic nutmeg appearance to the liver. And the last slide I want to show you on ferrets today is this one. Again, this is the heart, and you can obviously see that we have large numbers or large enough numbers of a nematode. This is Dirofilaria immitis, so this is cardiac dirofilariosis. In a ferret, ferrets are susceptible to heart disease if they live in an area of the country where it's prevalent. And like cats, because their heart is so small, it takes very few worms to create significant clinical syndrome, and these ferrets can go into congestive heart failure with all the clinical symptoms and other lesions that will go along with that. So that is my last section on ferrets. I don't know how many people like to dress their ferrets up, but if you go through the internet, you'll find more ferrets in cute costumes than you will just about anything else. So I'm going to finish up with the section now, and when we come back for number 4, we're going to go through the mammals again. So we're going to talk about other mammals and go through them in a bit of a taxonomic system, and sort of leave the pet species behind and talk more about those that we're going to see in more of a zoological or private collection situation.